Check 1 2 1 2 1 2.
Testing 1 2 3 for the YouTube. 1 2 3, testing for the live stream. Mel Blake, can you let us know if you can hear me on Zoom?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. We'll be starting in 1 minute. Take your seats. We'll start in 1 minute. Thank you.
You think it's going to.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call us to order, please. This is the second meeting of the Emergency Preparedness and Protective Services Committee. I do want to acknowledge we are on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe First Nations people. We have a fairly light agenda today, but important subject matter to cover. Glad to see everyone here. Before we begin, are there any declarations of interest? Seeing none. A confirmation of the minutes, meeting number 1, 13th of February, 2023. Any issues with the minutes? Are the minutes of that meeting confirmed? Okay, thank you. Item 4, status update, emergency preparedness. Sorry. Oh yes, we're going to do a roll call. I'm just so excited to get through our agenda today. I'll turn to the committee coordinator and take roll call. Thank you.
Councillor Bradley.
Here.
Councillor Daroche.
Présent.
Councillor Dudas. Councillor Devine.
Here.
Councillor Hubley.
Here.
Councillor Johnson.
Here.
Councillor Kelly.
Here.
Councillor Lu.
Morning, Chris.
Conseillère Plante.
Je suis là.
Vice Chair Hill.
Présent.
You have quorum, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have carried the minutes, so we'll go through the agenda. Item 4 is a status update, Emergency Preparedness Protective Service Committee inquiries and motions for the period ending March 21st, 2023. Are we able to receive this item? Yes, Councillor?
I will have just a small question, not about what's within the document, but just about the status of the document. I'm not sure when to ask that. It's very minor.
Okay, the committee's indulgent. We'll allow the question now. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you for indulging. It just so still being relatively new to the system here, I'm noticing that in all of our committee agendas, there are these documents, these outstanding inquiries and motions. So, on a slow day, we just started taking a peek at the actions, at the items within these documents. And I had assumed that all of the inquiries and motions within these documents were about business that was still pending. But just my staff just did a quick little review, and some of these are already complete. So I just wasn't sure if the purpose of having these in these agendas is so that I can remain vigilant about business that is still yet to be done. And if some of the items are already complete, for example, are these documents regularly administered and kept up to date?
Yeah, go ahead.
Happy to answer that on behalf of the clerk's office, if that would be of assistance.
Yeah.
Has directed that the Office of the City Clerk report out to each committee and to council every second month on the status of any outstanding motions, inquiries, and directions to staff. These are usually current at the time at which the agenda is published. However, in some cases, If something is not up to date and a member brings that to our attention, we'll follow up with the relevant department to mark it as completed.
Thank you.
Any other questions on this item? Okay, so can we receive this item? Thank you. The next item, item 5, is the May 2022 Derecho Severe Weather Event After Action Review. Staff do have a presentation. So we're going to go to that matter now. Just a button I can press that. I don't have to hold my microphone. There we go. Thanks very much. So just a brief introduction, and then I'll yield the floor to the general manager. Public Safety Service has completed an after action review of the May 2022 Derecho extreme weather event. And the report before us today outlines the lessons learned from this event. The review examined the city's preparedness, response, and communications, and assessed what worked well and what could be improved going forward. The review focused on the city's actions and its role in managing emergencies. Although many external organizations contributed to the broader response, external agencies, including Hydro Ottawa, are out of scope for this particular review. Beth Gooding, Director of the Public Safety Service, will provide a presentation of this report. First, I'll yield to the General Manager, Kim Ayotte, for some opening remarks. General Manager.
Thank you, Chair. Today, we'll be presenting our lessons learned from the May 2022 Derecho extreme weather event. This event was unprecedented for the city and impacted a large part of the residents of Ottawa. Sans précédent pour la ville, cet événement météorologique a touché une grande partie des résidents d'Ottawa. Our emergency management plan is an all-of-city approach, and this event was no exception. The response was not just by the emergency services alone, but also included in other internal partners, such as Public Works, Community and Social Services, as well as external partners such as Ottawa Hydro, Red Cross, Salvation Army. I can't name them all because so many different people and organizations were involved. I can't thank them enough for their dedication and support throughout this emergency. Staff came in and supported the emergency response while their own power was out and trees were down. I would like to take a minute to thank the staff of the Office of Emergency Management and Beth Gooding for her leadership. Je souhaite prendre une minute pour remercier le personnel du Bureau de gestion de mesures d'urgence et Beth Gooding pour son leadership. While we can learn from this experience and do better, we also did well in many areas, and I'd like to acknowledge that as well. Beth will now prepare or provide you with a presentation and will be available for answers afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. Merci de nous avoir accueillis. We can go into the agenda slide. The purpose of can people hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Is this better? Yeah, okay. So the purpose of the briefing is to share the results of the after action review for the derecho storm of May 2022. But we're going to do some quick scene setting to provide some context first on the program and our timeline of events, because it will help you understand the results a little bit better. So we'll just jump into the next slide, which is the purpose of an after action review. So after action reviews are just a healthy part of emergency management. It's really important for us to do continual learning and to seek improvement. Some of you have heard me say this before, but all emergency management programs have 3 main components: foresight, oversight, and hindsight. So the foresight piece is about, understanding the current and future threat environment and how that may impact us. The oversight is about having the right governance and documentation in place to guide our emergency response. And the hindsight is about doing things like the after action review to assess how we perform during an emergency and how we may improve going forward. And our ultimate outcome really is to provide better service to the residents of Ottawa, but we do that through an AAR by looking internally at ways to improve our internal practices and processes. So next slide. So just a quick recap. Every municipality in Ontario is legislatively mandated to have an emergency management program. The City of Ottawa has a very robust one. It comprises all of the city's departments, the emergency services, as well as other key services, and the 3 boards. We also have a very strong governance framework in place. At the highest level, it's chaired or led by our city manager and facilitated by GM Kim Ayot from Emergency and Protective Services Department. And I should mention that we have a very small and mighty Office of Emergency Management that supports the city's overall framework and is responsible for key preparedness activities such as training, exercise, and public engagement. And although it may be hard to see on the slide, the diagram here is our guiding light during an emergency response. The circles on the outside represent our priorities, so things like saving lives, reducing suffering. And the circle in the middle is our overarching objective, which is to maintain public confidence. Next slide. So just quick recap about our city's response escalation framework. When we're not responding to a situation, we're in normal operations. And otherwise, when we are responding, we have 4 levels of escalation. So monitoring, enhanced, activated, and state of emergency. And I had mentioned earlier the foresight component of our program, and that includes kind of early warning and constant information gathering. And we do that through our service duty officer network. So we have service duty officers representing 22 different city services who are constantly available to receive information from the field. And it's their job when something happens to relay it to the corporate duty officer, which is from the Office of Emergency Management. And then the corporate duty officer will take the information, assess what types of supports may be required, what impacts there might be to residents, and what escalation might be needed up to and including mobilizing the Emergency Operations Center. Next slide. So this is just a reminder that the city's emergency management program is part of a broader ecosystem. Donc, tout le monde a un rôle à jouer. C'est vraiment un système de système. And like I said, we wanted to just put this in there because it pertains to some of the recommendations in the after action report. Okay, next slide. So just some background on the derecho storm. On Saturday, May 21st, 2022, cold air from Michigan blew into Ontario and created the conditions for a really violent storm. It hit Ottawa around 3:30 p.m. in the afternoon and resulted in widespread devastation, including, severe power outages, downed trees, damage to homes and vehicles and things like that. Across Ontario and Quebec, which was the main path of the storm, there was also very tragically some deaths, mostly associated with falling trees. And so it was a very a sad situation. Next slide. So this slide here provides a high-level timeline of what happened in Ottawa. As I mentioned, the storm hit here around 3:30 p.m. And from a City of Ottawa emergency management program perspective, the system was definitely working because shortly thereafter, our corporate duty officer started to get a bunch of calls from other city services, most notably Ottawa Fire Services and 311. And we were trying to assess the extent of the damage. We immediately called a service duty officer network call to get as much information as possible. We mobilized the Emergency Operations Center and we went into enhanced operations right away. I should also say that what happened that Saturday evening was normal for most severe weather events, in that the first 24 hours or so are really about emergency response. So fire, ambulance, and police, and we saw that. I can share that in the 24 hours following the storm, our 911 service received 2,800 calls. During a normal 24-hour period at that time of year, it's 900 calls. And so they received over 3 times as many calls as they normally would right after the derecho. And I think our first responders did a fantastic job at supporting people in need right afterwards. We'll talk a little bit later in the deck about some of our new human needs work. So the only other thing I'll highlight here is that the derecho resulted in a massive amount of work for our Public Works Department from a debris cleanup perspective. They also did organic waste collection. And I should mention that they had to make repairs to about 175 signalized intersections and over 650 traffic signs, which were damaged by the wind. Next slide. So we mobilized, like I said, our Emergency Operations Center for 17 days. We had about 100 staff directly supporting the EOC. And we also had 1,000 city staff, more, I guess, than that, on the front lines doing debris cleanup, managing emergency reception centers and things like that. What we wanted to highlight here is that our staff are also residents of the city, and they were personally impacted in some cases by the storm. So they also didn't have power at home, or they were dealing with insurance to get rid of a downed tree on their property. And so we're really grateful for the amount of work that staff put in when they themselves were in difficult situations. I'm kind of speaking fast, and I know that Kim might want to jump in. I don't know, Kim, you just jump in whenever you want. Yeah. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the next 3 slides provide some high-level statistics to explain what the city did following the storm. I do want to caveat here, though, that we're very aware that some residents really suffered as a result of the aftermath of the derecho, and so we don't want to minimize that in any way. This is not to pat ourselves on the back, but more just to give you a kind of global view of what we did after the storm. Donc, je vais répéter en français parce que c'est très important. Au cours des prochaines 3 diapositives, nous allons partager certaines statistiques qui démontrent les activités de la ville d'Ottawa après la tempête. Mais le but n'est pas de nous congratuler, c'est juste pour vous donner un sens global de ce qu'on a fait. I'm not going to read the statistics, but what I will say about debris management, as I mentioned before, is that our Public Works Department are actually still in recovery. There's work that they're going to continue doing in 2023. We don't have an exact count of the number of trees that were lost in Ottawa, but we know that it's in the thousands. And the reason we don't have an exact count is that we haven't been able to get accurate numbers on the amount of trees we lost on private property, as well as NCC property. Next slide, please. So the human needs aspect of any emergency response are always the city's top priority. And these statistics kind of speak for themselves, but I will caveat again here that we worked very closely with a range of social services partners within the city, obviously Community and Social Services Department, Ottawa Public Health, but also the Food Bank, Ottawa Community Housing, the Red Cross, Samaritan's Purse. And so as a result of those partnerships, we were able to support a broad range of residents in need. And most notably, we were able to send out 67,000 meals to people who needed them in the 2 weeks following the storm. Next slide. So these are our last statistics, and this is to paint a little picture of the communications piece. Again, I'm not going to read through the statistics other than to say that our public information and media relations team did an amazing job after the storm. They stood up their own command center, which was attached to our emergency operations center. And they really worked around the clock to get as much information as possible in as many forums to residents. I will say that the media availabilities and press conferences are really important because the media picks them up on the radio. So for people who have a battery operated or a crank radio, they can still get the information they need from the city. And I also wanted to highlight that PIMR did a fantastic job at sharing information with residents in languages other than English and French. And we found that to be a best practice in emergency response. When people are dealing with the aftermath of a situation, they're very stressed, and it's important for them whenever possible to get information in their first language. Okay, so that was our quick overview. Now we're just going to jump into the actual, with the next slide, please, and the actual AAR methodology. I've already explained at the beginning the purpose of the AAR. I just wanted to highlight a couple things about how we did it. I will say that we engaged an external consultant to help with our data collection and analysis. And I think that's a good practice because it's always good to get an outside perspective when you're doing this kind of self-reflection. And we focused on the three areas that come up most commonly in emergency management, which is preparedness, response, and communications. As I mentioned earlier, our AAR is internal looking, and so it really only assessed the city's activities and outcomes. We didn't look at Hydro Ottawa, the telecommunications providers, or any of our social services partners, for example. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of what worked well, we can summarize it just in three buckets, I guess. As I mentioned earlier, the city does have a robust emergency program supported by strong documentation. And what we found during the derecho was that it provided us with a great framework with which to organize our response. I can share personally that I was the city's EOC commander for this situation. And at the beginning, especially in the first couple of days, it was so chaotic with so much information coming in, so many requests for assistance, calls at 2 in the morning. And so there was times when I needed to just take a moment and flip through our emergency management documentation to make sure I wasn't missing anything, And so they're not documents that just live on the shelves. They're operational documents that we rely on. And the second thing, or the second bucket of sort of success was the experience and knowledge of our staff, including our emergency responders. We've been through a lot of situations in Ottawa, and we do a lot of training and exercise, and that showed during the derecho is that our staff knew what to do and were willing to do it, which is great. And as I mentioned earlier, the city is always looking to improve on its communications during an emergency response, especially when there's a prolonged power outage. But our Public Information and Media Relations Command Center did a great job and tried to get as much information as possible to residents in need. Next slide, please. Okay, so what could be improved? So I will talk about each one in turn here. As I mentioned, we do have a core cadre of city staff who have excellent knowledge and experience and are able to ramp up during an emergency response. But we also find that that cadre is relatively small. And so we keep on calling on the same people. And during a prolonged response like the derecho, those people don't have natural backups. And so they weren't able to get appropriate breaks, if any, which is not good from a burnout perspective. And so we want to make sure going forward that we keep building internal capacity to expand the amount of staff we have capable of fulfilling key roles in the EOC, as well as on the front lines at things like command posts. Kind of related to that, as I mentioned earlier, the city does its emergency management in an ecosystem that includes a broad range of external stakeholders. And what we need to keep on doing is working with them, especially at the individual and community level, to build resilience and knowledge about emergency preparedness, So we'll talk a little bit more about some of the work we're doing in that area, but it really is that mantra of neighbors helping neighbors and community-based resilience, that we want to focus on going forward. From a city's response perspective, it really is about the human needs and the community supports that we want to enhance every time we do a response. And I was looking at the Community and Social Services Department's term in review report, and something they said really resonated with me. They said, social services are essential to people's survival and yet invisible to those they do not impact. And I think that was really what we saw during the derecho, was that there was a lot of community need. And so when we see that, we want to make sure that we bolster our processes such that we can more efficiently and effectively do things like distribute food within the community as fast and efficiently as possible in the next time. So that's something that we're working on. And it really is about that ecosystem that I talked about. Donc, je peux partager que on a travaillé avec la Banque alimentaire et d'autres organismes d'aide. Et grâce à ça, on a pu ensemble distribuer 67 000 repas aux membres vulnérables de la communauté. Donc, pour moi, c'est clair que quand on travaille ensemble, on atteint des meilleurs résultats. So I was just saying, probably with some mistakes, that during the derecho, we worked very closely with the Ottawa Food Bank and other social services partners. And it was because of that partnership that we were able to distribute so many meals to the community. So it was a good example to me of the fact that our response is strengthened through partnerships and relationships, you know? And again, as we mentioned earlier, we're always seeking ways to improve and enhance our communications to residents. Next slide. Oh, we also surveyed counselors, the ones who were present during the derecho, and the feedback that we heard was similar to the results of our AAR, which is good because counselors form part of our city's ecosystem. Definitely you are part of Team Ottawa and you have a unique role to play during emergency responses. And so we're pleased to see that your feedback aligned with what we saw in the AAR. And in particular, from a counselor perspective, it was on enhancing the boots on the ground community supports, you know? Okay, next slide. Okay, so these are our next steps. Like I said, we like to do AARs. We like to receive the feedback. It's a good learning opportunity. And what we're doing right now is we're starting to work on all of the recommendations. We're focusing first on those community supports because they're so important. We've already completed the food security protocol. We've been working with the Ottawa Food Bank, Ottawa Community Housing, Ottawa Public Health, and CSSD on that. And I'm pleased to say that the Ottawa Food Bank has volunteered to be the inaugural chair of our food security task force going forward. So that's a really nice relationship that we're developing there. And we're starting to work on our wellness visit protocol right now, which will include guidance for residents who are often best placed to check in on their neighbors themselves, you know? Like I said, it's always about building that neighbors helping neighbors community resilience piece. And more broadly, you know, we've also had some audits recently related to the pandemic and the convoy. And, you know, I think all emergency management programs all over the world are taking the opportunity to sort of recalibrate and reassess programming post-pandemic. And that's what we're doing too. And so we're taking the results of the AAR, the audits, and we're rethinking our priorities. And what we'd like to do is create a new emergency management strategy for the city to refocus our efforts and make sure that everyone understands what we want to do over the next 3 to 5 years. I think that's our last slide. I speak fast, sorry about that, but the last slide is just a big thank you to the community because we did see a lot of people who were suffering, but also really stepping up and trying to help and doing their part. And it was very heartwarming to see that. So big thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Gooding. Merci beaucoup pour votre présentation ce matin. We have one delegation, which we'll listen to first before we take questions. I do also want to acknowledge, though, in addition to Ms. Gooding and GMA, that we have Chief Hutt here from Ottawa Fire Services, Chief Poirier from Emergency or the EMS, Ms. Thurkelson from Bylaw, and others who can take and contribute to questions that committee may be posing in a few minutes. First, we'll hear our delegation. So Michael Wood. Good morning, Mr. Wood. You have 5 minutes. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for Councillor David Hill asking me to come down here and speak to everybody. Over the last 3 years, I've been advocating for a lot of people, and this is why I'm here, because the Direcco played a significant role in our city and with our emergency response. I recently met with Miss Gooding, and everything is going to change. This is not going to be a singular experience with the Direcco. We are going to continue to look at needing more and more emergency response as we continue on. Now, that doesn't mean just storms. 911 right now needs an update. And I am currently meeting with the president of the Treasury Board for Ontario, who is putting me before the Commissioner of Emergency Response. I will give you all some background based on the emergency situations that many of our residents face. The pandemic took an incredible toll on people's mental health. I have a family member in Toronto that suffers from alcoholism. I've received 6 telephone calls in a year and a half saying that they were going to end their life. Having said that, when I call 911 in Ottawa, I'm told that I can't be transferred to Toronto to speak to emergency services there. And if we look at the Direcco and other emergency services, there's going to be families across Ontario looking to speak to somebody here in Ottawa via 911, or there's going to be people like myself looking to speak to Toronto Police Services, fire, ambulance directly. When I called 911 in Toronto, after my family member had told me that they had committed an act to end their life, I was told to hang up and to call non-emergency in Toronto because I could not connect me. Having said this, I was on hold for an hour and a half while I was waiting for this to happen. Councillor Hill knows that this happened. We've had conversations about this, and I'm not here just for my family. I'm here for your families that are suffering from this exact challenge. I'm here for all the residents of Ontario. Now, I do understand that NG 911 is coming out, next generation 911, where you're going to be able to text, where you're going to be able to FaceTime, video call. However, as it stands right now, if we look at simple business, if you call somewhere, that call generally for a big business is not being routed to somewhere here in Ottawa, and it's being transferred back. There is no reason why with 911, where people's lives are in danger, that they cannot just transfer the call to the city. The first call should, or the first question should be, what city do you require police, fire, ambulance in? I can say Toronto and then be connected, so I'm not on hold. So that's why I'm here today. Thank you, Councillor Hill, for asking me to come down. I know most people on the panel, and thank you for hearing me out, and we will make changes to help families all across Ontario and Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Wood, for your delegation. I'll just see if any colleagues have questions. Councillor Devine.
Hello, Michael. Thank you for coming in. Just so I understand, if what you're saying is you're looking for a system where if I call 911, that the first question I'm asked by the dispatcher is, what city do you want to be connected to?
Right.
So that would be a centrally operated 911, not a region or city-based 911, but a centrally operated 911?
Well, Councillor, with the technology that we experience every day,
Yeah.
I don't think it would be that complicated to make an upgrade that the call can be transferred. So it comes into Ottawa, it goes to Toronto. Somebody in Thunder Bay wants to check in on a family member in Ottawa, then they can call. It's an emergency situation and be transferred here. And that's why I'm meeting with the Commissioner of Emergency Management for Ontario, just to try and help more people.
Thank you, because I mean, I absolutely sympathize with the concern that I think you're expressing, which is that if you as a resident of this city want to ensure that a loved one in that city gets proper care, and if you hypothetically are the only person that can attend to that person's needs. You just want some kind of system to be able to make sure that you can get that service done, right?
That is correct, sir.
Thank you. If I have a question to staff about the pros and cons of that, do I ask that now or? Great. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Wood. I'll circle back to staff and ask about I appreciate the intent for sure. I'll follow up with staff about the practicalities of it. Thank you.
Absolutely. And everybody's welcome to reach out to me.
Great. Thank you again, Mr. Wood. Thank you.
Thank you, Council.
Okay, this is the portion where if members of the committee have questions for staff about the presentation on the derecho response. Now is the time. Any?
Yep.
Councillor Devine?
Oh, I think other hands came up.
Okay. I have Councillor King, Hubley, Kavanaugh, LaRoche, Johnson, Hill. Everybody.
That's a good thing.
Councillor King.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll keep my question short. I do appreciate the fact that in the report, we see that staff will examine formal response protocols in terms of food security, wellness visits, and volunteer management. I know during the course of the storm, all councillors who were massively affected were on the ground and assisting with that process. And I think most councillors, I would agree with the assessment that when I went to the emergency reception center that was established in Overbrook, the services were appropriate. I think the challenge for the community was the speed of response. And I understand, of course, we had to respond to the emergency, but notwithstanding that, I'm just curious whether staff is going to examine implementing standard operating procedures in vulnerable neighborhoods and communities specifically to address emergency response around food security. I know that we are focused obviously on a citywide response, but there were some gaps definitely in terms of speed of response and the amount of inquiries that the councillors had to make in order to get movement on the ground in terms of the establishment of the emergency response centers. So I just wanted to know whether we are going to look as part of this policy, looking at establishing a standard operating procedure specifically in vulnerable neighborhoods and for vulnerable communities.
Thank you, Councillor King. I'd be happy to start answering that question. And speed of response is always a concern. Obviously, we have our emergency services, fire, paramedics, police who respond immediately to deal with life-threatening situations and help people in need. And we had a lot of firefighters and paramedics and police on the road helping people. When it comes to opening up community centers, again, we have to ramp that up, and I appreciate the need for speed, if you will. There's also a requirement, and this is where we're going to kind of have to try and push out more of our public education with regards to the first 72 hours. Our first 72 hours is it's difficult for the city to ramp up within an hour. And I think that what we want to do is educate the public to be self-sufficient to a certain degree. We understand that not everybody can do that, and that it's not perfect. But yeah, especially in a storm of this magnitude, in the large geography that it affected, the amount of people that were affected, it was extremely difficult to, open everything up. If it was in your community only, opening up that community center might have been a quicker task, but having to respond to the entire city made it more difficult. I'll ask Beth to add to that because I think that our future does have to look at those considerations.
Yes, Mr. Chair, through you, thank you for the question. I can also add that, and I probably should have mentioned this in the presentation, as we work on those protocols, including food security, which is finished now, in the background, we're also working with community and social services and Ottawa Public Health to map vulnerabilities specific to wards. And so our idea is to, in the future, be able to pull up a map of the city and hone in on neighborhoods and buildings that we know in particular may need more assistance than others.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that work. And my last supplemental question, Chair, is whether the food security protocol that has been developed in terms of this emergency management framework will inform the food security policy that is being formulated for the community safety and well-being plan. So I know that that would probably fall under the guise of community services. But I'm just wondering if there's interconnection between this food security protocol that's being developed for emergency management and the food security policy that will be part of the community services and well-being plan.
So thank you for that. While we worked very closely with Community and Social Services Department on the food security protocol, it was written specific to situations in which the Emergency Operations Center is mobilized. And so it really was through the lens of emergency management and to be used only under those conditions. I don't know to what extent CSSD is taking portions of that to other files, but our protocol is really specific to us.
Okay, I appreciate that. I think that those are questions maybe to be asked at the other committee, but I think it would make sense that we don't silo these policies. Everyday requirements should also reflect and take into consideration emergency response as well. So I thank you for the work that you undertook in the communities during the storm. I know that I did that immediately after the storm, but we really did appreciate the work of our first responders and all of the staff in terms of the huge task of responding to human needs in our community. Very appreciative of the work that staff undertook. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor King. Next, Councillor Hubley, and then Kavanagh. Councillor Hubley.
Thank you. I want to start by thanking city staff for the presentation today, but also to thank all our staff for the work that was done during the storm. For Chief Ayotte in particular and Chief Hutt, the firefighters, the men and women of the station at Eagleson were just amazing in my community. That Saturday night they were out, Sunday they were out. They were helping people to make their property safe, get trees off of cars if they could. There was all kinds of work that the firefighters were doing. And sometimes it was just helping out seniors with small tasks, but something that was too difficult for the seniors to do themselves. So to me, they once again stepped up for our community when the community was in need. And so a special shout out to them. I also want to thank Alain Gonche and his people. Everything they did in the cleanup, including by day 2 or 3, they were already moving on getting the dumpsters into the area so that people could take all the damage, what became garbage, unfortunately, to these dumpsters so that it was removed in a timely manner from the community. The effort to do that was not easy, and yet they did a very good job of getting that stuff out there. I think we should also give a shout out to the Ministry of Natural Resources from the province. They sent crews in on the Sunday to help with the cleanup. And I can tell you, I stood in a neighborhood with residents who were actually filming the work that these folks were doing, because natural resources are the ones that go into the forest when there's fires, at Algonquin Park and so on. And they had these giant chainsaws, and it was like watching artists at work, how fast they could go down a tree and make the area safe. And so it was something to watch, but it also gave my community the reassurance that the city and the province was there to help them at the time and try and restore normal as soon as possible. One of the things, too, that I want to mention before I get into some of the things where we can improve upon was forestry. The forestry department were amazing through all this. They had teams come in relatively quickly to start the cleanup, to make, for example, we have a lot of natural paths in my community that people enjoy very much. Well, there was trees that hadn't fallen yet. Some were, dangling, and a strong enough wind could have easily brought some of those branches down on people. Forestry got in there very quickly, got that cleaned up, and what probably impressed me the most out of their work was that by the fall they were already starting the replanting program to bring these areas back. Sure, it's going to take time for the trees to grow, but it really sent a strong message to the community when they saw the forestry department have people going in planting replacement trees already. One of the areas I think is a common theme in this is how quickly we responded to the different issues that came out of the storm. Beth touched on some of that. There's some other issues there too. I think there's fair criticism that it may have taken us a while, like a day or two, to get organized on this. I know, for example, although hydro is not part of this report, there was several concerns with the hydro response at the start. But my hope is that all departments and agencies have learned from this experience so that next time the response can be even faster. I gave the example earlier of the dumpsters. Nobody would think about that in a storm, but this was a case where that was necessary. And once they figured that out, the staff were quick at trying to secure any available dumpster and get them into not just my community, but all parts of the city. So I hope for all the departments that that's a takeaway for them, that they can make notes to what maybe took a couple of days to get organized, so that next time it will only take hours. One last thing I want to point out was that the Parks and Rec people, Dan Genier's team, they had the Canada Leisure Center open that night for people to get in there. And I know because I met with the councillor from Stittsville. He was there charging up his phone so that he could communicate with his residents. I think one of the go forwards here is, there was our go-to way to communicate with people is to go to social media. But most of the homes and people in my area didn't have any power, so they didn't have any internet. They had their phones for as long as they could keep them charged. But, we still have a significant number of people who are not on smartphones. They might have, a flip cell phone just for emergency purposes, but they don't have the data on that, and they're not familiar with how to get to ottawa.ca to get info and stuff. So we have to include them in our plans as well. And I think a lesson learned for me was that it wasn't helpful just to get it onto social media. I had right away that Saturday night, I was out on the street talking with residents, making notes of where help was needed, and working with city staff to arrange to get help out to those residents as soon as possible. There was many very touching stories that'll stay with me probably for the rest of my life that I saw that weekend. But the response from our firefighters and our city staff is something that I will always be proud of for being part of this city. So thank you very much. Thank you, Chair, for your indulgence.
Thank you, Councillor Hubley, for your comments as well as your compliments and praise for staff, which has been well earned and deserved. Thank you. Next, we have Councillor Kavanagh and then Councillor DeRoche. Councillor Kavanagh.
Thank you very much, Chair. And yes, thank you to the team. It was a long weekend, so trying to get a hold of people was a little more difficult, and that was a factor, and we can't forget about that. So that was a disadvantage, but I have to say that I was able to get through to management on just about every level, and that was very helpful. And I want to say thank you about that. Like Alain Gontier with trying to get a dumpster. I got a dumpster story too, Alain, where we didn't have a place for one. So I was able to call RioCan and ask them if we could put it on their property, and they said yes. So we were able to do that very quickly. So thanks to, I'll give a shout out to RioCan for that because it was very helpful and had to be done very quickly and had to be taken away very quickly because it started to stink. But it all got done. So those are over and above. So I really appreciate that. We have to take into account the fact that we had really good weather. Despite the fact that this was a weather situation, we had very good weather. So nobody suffered from extreme heat or extreme cold. And that would put a different level on this whole situation. So that's something we have to prepare for. I found that it was very difficult to know which areas were affected because the mapping was problematic. And I know Hydro Ottawa was working on that. It was just an overwhelming situation, and I'm not criticizing. It was just the reality of the situation. I was able to get around. I rode my bike around the community, and if I saw people standing around outside in the street, I knew that their power was out. If there's one thing, they started talking to each other, and it was actually very social. So, and they did things like share generators, and that's something that actually has to be addressed. Is that a good idea or not? Because I know that there was concerns about fire hazards, et cetera, if there's too much sharing of generators. So that was a concern. But overall, I'd say that people felt they were well served. I guess the biggest frustration and the only question they want to answer is when's my power coming back? And I couldn't give them that answer. So any kind of updates from the city, they were, okay, that's fine. But when's my power coming back? When's my power coming back? And I had a hard time to, be able to answer that because you had to understand the triage, and it was immense. So that was something to talk about. In terms of the emergency centers, we don't have one in Bay Ward, but that was always been a problem. We found that out in different situations. So that's hard. Talking about 911, our issue of anyone who lives near the river, you get circuited to Quebec. So, and that's been an ongoing issue. You have it too. Yeah. So we've talked about this before, but just a reminder during a situation like this, there'll be a lot of calls. So those are all things that are working on. I'm going to be the lead on the freshet season. And that's when you see coming, right? The freshet is, the water gets higher. We know it's coming. Not like the derecho where it just hits you in the back of the head. So this one, I don't think it's going to be a problem here, by the way. It's looking good. But never say never. Is it raining this weekend? But it's about being prepared. One suggestion I have is, can we have sort of a texting system? Like, I think that's probably the one thing that we can use, like when we're low on power or have very little power, we're on our phones. Maybe we can't go to ottawa.ca like Alan was saying, but if we have text messages, and I was thinking of at two levels, one internally for us as counselors getting information very quickly, like boom, it's, you can send it out, and external that people sign up and use phones because they're not going to go to ottawa.ca. And so that way people are up to date, and it's becoming more and more common to use texting as a source of information. The other thing that I was very concerned about is buildings with no generators. If you've ever seen a building without a generator during a situation when there's no power, it's very frightening. And do we have a map of all those buildings that do not have generators? I think as a city, we need to know which ones do not have generators. I'm happy to say that Ottawa Community Housing has most of their high rises have generators. However, the ones that didn't, we've heard stories about people in wheelchairs being trapped on the 9th floor in the dark with no water because their water doesn't work either because you need electricity to pump water. Very frightening situations. And we as a city cannot deal with demanding generators or putting in bylaws or anything like that. It has to be done by the province. And I know there's a private member's bill on that, but we should at least know which areas are problematic because they will need more help. And it's overwhelming, the situation for that. So those are some of the things. anyway, I'll let my colleagues speak, but I hope that we can look into some of those things for sure. If you have any comments, that'd be great. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor, for that. Councillor DeRoche, you're next, and then Councillor Johnson. Councillor DeRoche.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was really extremely interested in this presentation and pleased to see this come forward. I think that there's great expectations in the community that when we have these types of incidents that we go back and look at how we can do better. And in my view, this is why my personal view, this is why we have this committee. We've always had a good spotlight on the fire department and the paramedics and bylaw. They were housed very well in other committees, but where this committee, I think, is going to play a critical role over the next 4 years is ensuring that there is strong collaboration and cooperation across our own branches and other jurisdictions on emergency preparedness, so that when we are asked the question, are we ready? The answer is yes. I think the answer is yes, but we know from whether it be the occupation or the storm that there's always room for improvement. And to me, one of the top asks will be of other levels of government to help us build this infrastructure to respond and to help residents prepare. A lot of praise to our staff, and I think it's well earned. But I do want to also thank some of the partners that have helped us, particularly the Salvation Army and other organizations. I'm glad there was some emphasis on that in the presentation. I'll say up front that over the last number of years, I've been volunteering with St. John Ambulance, and they recently received a grant from Emergency Preparedness Canada to help build a database so that when there are major incidents, the authorities can tap into that network of people who are trained. And it's one of these sort of grim situations where if there is an event and the emergency service people can't get there for whatever reasons, that you have citizens that have first aid training that can provide some support and relief. So my question to the staff, Mr. Chair, is just really if they could put some spotlight on the work they're doing to kind of work with those community partners, such as St. John Ambulance, that I think can play a key role to help us and not just our own resources. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. Does staff want to comment on that last point, please?
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chair, through you. It was an excellent question. We do have, in some cases, formal agreements with NGOs, including Canadian Red Cross, Salvation Army, and Ottawa Search and Rescue. And we also have relationships more informally with others, including St. John's Ambulance. But I think your point is an excellent one, and it's something that we want to improve post-pandemic. Like many people, the lockdowns didn't help our relationship building. And so we want to make sure that we take the opportunity now to re-engage and work together. The model that we envision going forward is relationships that are so close that we're training and exercising together, and with the community as well. And so that's what we're striving for going forward.
Good. I'm glad to hear that, and thank you for the answer. And just a last comment, Mr. Chair, the pieces of the puzzle are coming together. We've got the feedback from this exercise. We've got the Auditor General's report on our response to the occupation. And we've got to continue on this path to make sure that we're learning from these experiences and we're getting stronger and we're putting investments in it and bringing our partners at the federal provincial levels to the table to help protect the nation's capital, which I would argue, not to scare people, but is going to be exposed to threats in our role as the nation's capital. So look forward to seeing some progress on this committee over the next 4 years, and I think so do the residents. Thanks.
Thanks very much for those comments. Councillor Johnson and then Vice Chair Hill.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to my committee members for this really thorough investigation of the report in front of us. I find that very reassuring because I know that we're all excited that it's getting warmer, but for some of us who have been directly affected by the derecho, it's also kind of like, So, we want to be as ready as we can be. So I wanted to explore a little bit more, picking up on what Councillor King and Councillor DeRoche have been speaking about with the relationship with on-the-ground community members and community partners. and also this potential for siloing between departments of the city of Ottawa when we look at how we encourage participation from our community members in the actions that we need to create this readiness, to create this resilience. And I wanted to explore a little bit our feelings as staff, or if I could ask staff to comment on the risk of what it looks like to engage community members in this action. Councillor Kavanaugh mentioned, this idea that generators being shared poses a risk, but it also really saved a lot of people's medicine, and it saved a lot of people's newborn babies of having, an equal amount of temperature. So I would be concerned that we would err on the side of risk adverse when it comes to how we support our community members. And right now there is a parallel conversation going on with community associations about their insurance. And that is somewhat siloed in the Parks and Rec aspect of their lives, right? So we're asking, people are concerned about whether or not they need to have director's insurance as community association board members. What kind of liability are they going to assume? People are having trouble getting support from the city to put pollinator parks or pollinator gardens in their parks because it's $5 million liability to put in a pollinator garden, right? So we're sending some messages here to community members to not play. Even just establishing community gardens. I'm working with Bell's Corners to put a community garden in Nepean housing land because I don't really want to make them go through the rigmarole of working through the city processes. So when we send signals over here about risk, and then we try and bring community associations in on this side, I am concerned that we are in fact creating two messages that are not complementary. So what do we need to do to address our relationship to risk with communities so that we can empower them to help one another when the city really needs them and as an essential part of this social infrastructure?
Thank you, through you, Chair. Great question. With regards to risk, I think there are different risk levels during an emergency versus during regular day-to-day operations. And from our perspective, engaging our risks with regards to engaging community groups and different volunteer type groups is around their ability to integrate with us and to work seamlessly so that we can get as much help out to everyone as possible. And our experience in the past, while we may have been more risk averse in the past, is that they often have different systems, different approaches, and it's not seamless in with the city operation. So you have conflicts on the ground trying to help people, which is not what you want. You want people to work together. So Beth can speak to what our future might hold with regards to training and making sure community understands, the command system and who's going to be directing what into what situations. With regards to risk from a liability perspective, during an emergency, there's more protection, I believe, and legal can maybe speak to that, but there's more protection to those groups with regards to Good Samaritan laws, et cetera, when they're actually helping individuals. So it's a different conversation than maybe the community groups with regards to their ranks and their board of directors, et cetera. But with regards to working with them, I'd ask Beth that.
Yeah, thank you. We recently released on ottawa.ca a community emergency management toolkit that provides guidance to organized entities like community associations, BIAs, faith-based groups, condo boards, property managers, that kind of thing, and how to develop their own emergency management plans. And what we've been doing is starting to go to their association meetings and talk to them about it and answer their questions. And I think it's a mutual benefit. So first of all, we're able to spread the message about the importance of emergency preparedness and being able to self-sustain for the first 72 hours. But they're also sharing really important information about us in terms of vulnerabilities in their communities that they want us to know about. And, their experiences and how we may be able to work with them to improve going forward. We are also working at the community level through the affinity groups in Ottawa to meet with residents who may have special concerns. So for example, we met recently with a wide range of accessibility advocacy groups, and that was organized by our city clerk's office. And we were able to hear about their special concerns related to their disabilities and what that looks like during an emergency for them. And so we don't view any negative with this community engagement, in that it's about sharing information both ways and making sure that we build build up emergency capacity together.
That's tremendous. And I appreciate all your efforts in that way. And I know, in speaking with you often that you have a great heart for the community and that you want to always continuously improve. But I perhaps then I just put forward the challenge to this committee and perhaps to other department heads that we probably will have to think about the overall message that we're sending community members, although there may be certain circumstances where we do X, Y, Z from a user perspective, from a community member perspective, we don't differentiate about which department we're working with at what time. And so when we think about preventative, your foresight, so community gardens, for example, as part of that food security policy, I'm certain that's what Councillor King is after, this kind of preventative mechanism so that we can invest so that our emergency situations are not quite as dire. Similarly, I have another question just around transparency. So even just as recently as December, when we had a really bad snowstorm, I was searching for the information about where my community members would go if the power went out for an extended period of time, because there are so many members of College Ward who have a lot of trauma post-tornado, post-derecho. So once the snow really starts flying, they're really concerned. Bell's Corners has connectivity issues. They're getting their station updated. Anyhow, so all this to say, we were not able to get an inside understanding of where community members would go if this was to happen again. And the reason was that I understood that we didn't want to share that information ahead of time, because then people would go to the place that they might have to go to early. And we would create a situation where people would go to a public building when there wasn't that threshold of emergency, and we would create this situation. And I am concerned that in the absence of information, it looks like we don't have a plan. Right. So when people are asking me and I'm going, oh no, once it gets really bad, I promise I'll be able to tell you where you go. This is not breeding confidence. So I wonder, what is the proactive way that we can be more transparent about our emergency management plans so that people can have confidence that they will have somewhere to go? Because I think right now the default is perhaps to be a bit more, when we're tiering up these levels of emergency. I'm not sure it's doing what we want.
That's a great point, Councillor, and we certainly appreciate your perspective and this line of questioning. Actually, unfortunately, we can't have all of the answers for every potential type of emergency. We've never seen a derecho before. This was unprecedented and new to us. So we try to plan for every eventuality. We have a risk program where we identify the top 10 risks. We've even expanded that this year to say, let's look at the top 30, because the top 10 might not include some of those other things like cybersecurity that we're concerned about, et cetera. So we try to plan for every eventuality, and Beth can get into specifics with regards to some of those plans. And certainly communications before an event is extremely important, and we appreciate that. We also, depending on the emergency, have to triage our resources. I think someone mentioned that earlier, and I think it's important to know that, we can't just put everything out at once. It just doesn't work that way. We don't have that capacity within the city to actually hit it all with 100% of our resources, even though we'd like to think we can and we will. It is staged, depending on timing, et cetera. But I'll get Beth to speak a little bit about the planning cycle, because I can assure you we have good plans. And I don't know why we wouldn't want to share it ahead of time, because I think that's part of the education process that we need to have. I think during the snowstorms, there were other conversations taking place as well. So Beth, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So what Kim didn't share is that he and I were talking in early January about the past year that we had, the emergencies, and he actually tasked me to work with our public information and media relations team to prepare set messaging that we could tweak and deploy ahead of emergency situations, including making the right call, between 211, 311, and 911. And so we have been working with Ghislain Lamotte's team on a sort of preemptive preparatory emergency management plan. And we are just reviewing some of those messages now. Some of them are related to extreme cold, some to extreme heat. so forth and so on. And so that is one of our lessons learned over the past couple of years. And you'll see that proactive messaging come out more regularly going forward.
I'm very glad to hear that, because we can, as counselors, be an ally for that, right? And then we don't flood 311, or we don't create those situations where we end up having more costly bylaws whatever it is, we can help with the more proactive. So I appreciate we're trying to find that balance between, you know, opening the floodgates and not knowing what's coming. I was actually going to ask you, you know, because you're also both meteorologists, what your vibe is for the springtime, because I didn't see that as part of this report either, but that's okay. Finally, and I know I've already spoken to Kim about this already, but I do think it would be very helpful in this instance to release the more comprehensive report publicly, especially in the context of all of the community partners that we're looking to engage and whatever directions we're looking to find for community associations and other, you know, loose networks. I think a more fulsome conversation about how you arrive to these outputs would be very helpful. So I was hoping that staff would take it as a direction to release this report publicly.
Thank you, Chair. I don't have a concern with that. I think that it's good to put some context behind it as to why we don't release after action reports historically or all the time. It does depend on the emergency, and you know, we certainly don't want to telegraph our response, which could put, you know, some people with nefarious kind of ideas ahead of us. You know, we all know that terrorists often have, you know, secondary devices they plant to try and harm responders. So we don't want to create that environment. So we're kind of careful, because these after action reports are very operational. You know, why didn't we go here? What did we do, et cetera? In this particular case, it was a storm. You know, we have no problem sharing it. And if we're given that direction, which I understand you're doing right now, we'll ask that it be publicly available, work through the clerk's office to make that happen, if that works for you.
Thank you very much for that. I appreciate all the work you've done.
Thank you, Councillor. Vice Chair Hill, and then Devine, Dudas, and Plante. Vice Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'll just echo the sentiments that I've heard from all of my colleagues so far on great appreciation for both the report and certainly for the folks that were out dealing with the situation at the time. Certainly, my recollection of that, I was on a bike ride with my oldest daughter. We were going from Barrhaven to Canada, and about kilometer 2, the clouds rolled in, and we said, we're going to have to change course. And on the way back, we ended up seeing 2 trees actually fly in front of us. I thought I was on the Wizard of Oz, but certainly when we got back, we recognized the importance of the issue, and certainly the response is appreciated. I just would follow up, I suppose, on Mr. White's comments on the 911 system. And certainly from the perspective of the Derico, there could be people, you know, that have received information, you know, from loved ones, you know, and maybe they're out in Barrie on Facebook or what have you, and they're reaching out to say, hey, I've got an elderly parent who I'm concerned about. They've signaled that they're having, you know, a heart issue or something else. And then they're unable to simply get through the system. And I was wondering if you could speak to, you know, what we're in the process of doing, or how we're in the process of kind of strengthening that operational communication system for 911, so that we're providing the best service we can, so that if somebody is in a situation where, you know, a loved one in another city calls them and says, I'm committing, you know, suicide or thinking of something terrible, the response is as streamlined as possible in order to provide the supports necessary.
I'll just jump in and say this deviates a little bit from the report before us. So if staff are able to answer now, that's great. If not, then maybe we can take that question that the Vice Chair is asking and respond after today's meeting.
Thank you, Chair. I think we can give a very brief answer now to try and satisfy or to provide an answer. Sure. And also our annual report is coming up in May for 911, and that would be an appropriate venue to continue this conversation as well.
Okay, thank you. And just very briefly, we recognize the need for intercity 911. The only jurisdiction that Ottawa can route a 911 call to right now directly is Gatineau, and it's because of the geography challenges that people have mentioned before, including myself. I live in the West End, and I'm often showing up on the Gatineau network. it's because of the way our current system is built and the technology it's using, which is 30 years old. It has limitations in terms of its ability to route. When we go over to next generation 911, which is end-to-end digital, we'll have a capacity to route anywhere, and we're going to be pushing for that. So we'll speak a little bit more about that when we come back in May for the 911 report, and it'll give us a chance to do a bit more technical research, Councillor.
100%. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. And thank you very much for your time. And I appreciate you, Mr. Chair, in allowing that question. To a more specific piece here. On slide 15, you referred to building internal capacity within the city. And I just wanted to kind of drill into that a little bit in terms of what does that actually mean? Is that, cross-training staff or, pre-positioning logistic installations or how do we do that?
Thank you, Chair. I think that's another great question. Our Office of Emergency Management is very small, but mighty and very good at coordinating these types of events. But the reality is it's an all of city response. And therefore, when we actually assign very important roles such as incident commanders, operations chiefs, planning chiefs, et cetera, within our incident management system, we need the people who go into those roles to clearly understand the processes for doing it. Now we have a great group of people who know that plan, whether it's Beth or our fire chief, paramedic chief, who've been around that system many, many times. The reality is we need to build that capacity because we're always going to the same people. So by training more people up to those levels, we'll be able to have proper scheduling and especially for longer duration events. If we're looking at a 3 to 5 or 6 hour event, then that's fine. We handle it internally. But if we're looking at multiple days, weeks, and we've experienced those lately, I think that that's where we need to have some of that rotation. I'll get Beth to speak to more specifics on that.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really important point. And so what we're doing is that we're looking at the range of positions that we know we have to build capacity within and seeing what we can do. That includes formal training, but a lot of it comes from experience. And so another thing that we're trying to promote and do is position shadowing during emergency situations. And so I can say, for example, that during the recent POTUS visit, I was not the EOC commander. I was the deputy, and Todd Piper was the EOC commander, and I was there to support him. And so that's the kind of thing that we're trying to do going forward across multiple positions, is expose people and give them an opportunity to learn by doing. I was at a conference this week, a police conference, and I heard something that really resonated with me. People who do emergency management, they're not like, behind glass and it's like in case of emergency break glass. they're people who have to do the training, have to develop the experience and do the learning on a regular basis. And so that's our challenge, is that it's really a program,
No, thank you. In the report, I didn't see anything with regard to the cooperation function with the National Capital Commission. And I just wondered if you could speak a little bit to that piece, because I know a lot of the damage that happened. I speak, from Barhaven. I commute up Woodruff all the time. And I know that space in there got very badly damaged, that impacted on some of our City of Ottawa infrastructure in terms of bike paths, roads and such. Could you just maybe highlight a little bit, how did that process of coordinating with the National Capital Commission go? Are there some points to improve on there? And going forward, are we satisfied with where we're at right now in terms of that cleanup and the replanting and such?
So again, thank you, Mr. Chair, through you. That relationship was led by our Public Works Department, as you can imagine, and they have ongoing discussions with their counterparts. We weren't able to get someone from there in the room today, but we can take that question back and provide you with a more fulsome response. Yeah.
That's more than fine. Thank you very much. Building on a question that Councillor Kavanaugh asked about the different protocols and the different seasonal issues that we could run into in these types of emergencies. Certainly kind of there's two phases in this, and I appreciate the way you broke it up in the report in terms of the actual incident that happened and the way that it was managed. But kind of common to all of these emergencies we're going to see ourselves getting into is going to be this Hydro Ottawa, Hydro One fragility issue. And certainly that was the back end of this. You know, the front end, we had the Derico, you know, years past, it was the tornado, it could be an ice storm, it could be something else. But I think it's a really important point that we kind of lucked out with the weather at that time of the Derico. You know, yeah, we had some food spoilage after day 2 and 3 kind of thing, but certainly there weren't people whose water pipes were freezing after, you know, night number 1. And so I was just curious, is there an existing winter protocol or cold weather protocol, or is that a protocol that perhaps should be looked at? Because if this type of extended hydro outage happened in February, we would probably be in a drastically different situation looking at the reporting on that.
Yeah, thank you again, Mr. Chair, through you. It's something that worries us as well. I think that any prolonged power outage in a situation of extreme heat or cold will make some residents more vulnerable and potentially unable to stay at their own houses. So we do have an extreme heat, cold, and smog working group led by Ottawa Public Health that considers these types of situations and the escalated response level that would be required. Without going into all the details, we do have good plans in place in terms of how the city would respond. And it really is focused on providing enhanced services with respect to emergency reception and lodging. So we'd be opening more centers and opening them overnight.
No, thank you very much. And Mr. Chair, I do think this is one that, you know, it speaks to the fragility of our existing hydro grid. I know this topic has come up in Environment Committee as well as we look at energy evolution. And I do think that the connective tissue that we have with Hydro Ottawa is an important one on a number of these issues that I think we need to make sure we close with so that we have that good communication function. That's all for me right now. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair. And once our fellow colleagues speak, I'll speak as well. And I'm going to touch upon Hydro Ottawa. I do have a direction to staff, which I'll introduce when I speak. Next on my list is Councillor Devine and then Dudas and Plante. Councillor Devine.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Kim and Beth, for your presentation. I absolutely and wholeheartedly appreciate the care and thoughtfulness that I can see that you're putting into this report. And I know that where we are now in terms of foresight, oversight, and hindsight are the result of some really tough lessons learned over 2 floods, a tornado that flattened my community, a derecho that flattened the entire city. And I wholeheartedly agree with some of the current concerns raised today about extreme weather disasters and what Councillor DesRoches was saying about that ensuring that we as a city are prepared to respond to the next crisis is certainly my primary reason for being on this committee. And that work does need to advance quickly. My own staff was noting that this weekend, we are expecting the kind of extreme temperature swing over 24 hours that typically is the kind of incident that can precipitate an extreme weather event. So I also had been a little bit surprised at the thinness of the report. I'm happy to hear that there was a more comprehensive document that, you know, that council will soon be seeing. And I think a lot of the questions that I have, and I do have a bunch of questions, address the fact that I just wasn't, I don't have that information in front of me. My first question, so from what I now understand, activities and actions of Hydro One and Hydro Ottawa were not part of this report. Considering that several parts of Ward 9 were among those areas hit without power for 12 days, considering the amount of confusion around communications that emanated due to the power outage, and considering the possible threat of these kinds of crises in -30 weather, I think it's imperative for me to ask, if only to find out, why were the actions and activities of Hydro One and Hydro Ottawa not a part of this report, not under the scope of this review? And following up on that first question, whether or not those utilities, especially Hydro Ottawa, are they conducting their own post-derecho review that we as council will be privy to?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, we don't have jurisdiction over Hydro Ottawa with regards to creating an after-action report, looking into their operations. That being said, we have been in contact with them closely. They do have an after-action report or review that they have themselves. I can't speak to whether or not they'll be presenting that at committee or not, but Beth, do you have any additional information on that? No, I think that's all I have for you. Sorry, but certainly I'm sure the chair will have a motion or direction with regards to contacting Hydro Ottawa.
So because I know that the chair is going to address this, but I guess it sounds like we have no oversight over that. I'll wait to hear what the chair says. I may follow up later. So my colleagues will remember that, the motion that I brought to council earlier about addressing power failures in high-rise apartments, during which I did refer to the extraordinary actions that Ottawa Fire Services had to perform during this crisis to attend to emergency needs. And so again, because I haven't seen the whole report, my question pertaining to this report is whether or not Ottawa Fire Services was consulted as a part of it, and whether or not these specific out of usual actions that Ottawa Fire had to perform for these buildings, was that addressed in this report?
Yes, thank you again, Mr. Chair, through you. Yes, Ottawa Fire Services had the chance to provide feedback to our EOC survey, and some of their experiences fed into the lessons observed. With respect to the apartment buildings that you're referring to, I will defer to Chief Hutt, who's in the room, and who may want to add more in terms of lessons learned specific to fire.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for that question, Chair, through you. Yes, every event is unique and significant, and we do have to do action post-incident analysis and reviews to see how we can serve our residents better. I think in particular where there were some issues or what came to light was in particular with, and it was mentioned earlier, with some of the high-rise buildings where when the power goes out, even though there is municipal water supplied to those buildings, when the above floors, they don't have access to that municipal water. So, there was after action items where, we have to have mechanisms in place where we can assist residents where, if they're refugeeing in their homes, that how are they getting that potable water to stay in their house. So that was one item that we took away, and we talked about it. And during this last power outage, we were able to assist the residents using a mechanisms of tools and equipment and resources that we had. But I think certainly moving forward, we that certainly tied up some of our resources. So is there other mechanisms that we can use in our community to help in those occurrences?
And I can, I can address the fact that my office is certainly still looking to advance the issue of emergency power in buildings. But until such a solution is found, I would only hope that in any kind of establishment of new protocols, that there be some anticipation that Ottawa Fire or some other solution might be required to address those people in those high-rise buildings, especially if, let's say, the next time this happens is in -30 weather. That would be even more critical. So in the report, in one of your areas for improvement, you suggested that the city will be developing formal response protocols in 3 areas: food security, wellness visits, and volunteer management. So from my perspective, disasters of this scope and scale are best responded when there's an all hands on deck response from staff as well as from communities as well, which is certainly how my community was as effective as we were in 2018 tornado. From the presentation here, I saw that you're still scoping the element of volunteer management. Can you paint a little picture about how you foresee the role of volunteers in this kind of emergency response? Or is it too soon?
No, thank you, Chair, through you. This is a great question, and I can explain a little bit about what we're scoping. The reason that the volunteer management protocol is a little bit more complicated is that there are 2 categories of volunteers. There's organized groups.
Samaritan's Purse.
Yeah, and then there's spontaneous volunteers. So people who are just interested in helping their neighbors and putting up their hands. The other things that makes it a bit more complicated is because volunteers want to do a range of things, including during the derecho, helping their neighbors by bringing chainsaws and chopping down trees. And so we have a bit more work to do in terms of making sure we manage those 2 groups appropriately and handle the safety aspects as well. And so what we're doing right now is we're looking at those two categories. We're doing a lot of research, looking at best practices in other cities and trying to figure out what makes sense such that we mobilize as many people as possible in as safe a way as possible.
Yep. Thank you. I look forward to hearing more about that because I fully recognize that there are two categories, but just as I fully recognize that even that latter category of, person who wants to put up their hand can and most likely will be an essential tool during a crisis of this scope. The last question I have, so in the what we heard went well section of the report, it was noted that the Human Needs Task Force, which had originally been established in response to the pandemic, was able to quickly transition to support broader community needs associated with the city's storm recovery effort. I also know that the Human Needs Task Force was decommissioned at the end of 2022. So I guess my real question is, if that Human Needs Task Force was as essential and as useful as it was, and if that Human Needs Task Force has been decommissioned, how will the current absence of that Human Needs Task Force affect future storm response?
Okay, thank you again, Mr. Chair. So while the Human Needs Task Force has been decommissioned as a specific entity, the processes and relationships that supported it will remain in place and are being kept up to date through our Community and Social Services Department. And so we've been working very closely with them to make sure that if the Emergency Operations Center is mobilized again, they can immediately count on those processes and relationships to form a human needs-like task force that will be part of the EOC. So like I said, it's the supporting framework that will remain in place despite the program not existing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I have next on the list, Councillor Dudas and then Plant.
Yes, thank you very much. I was very happy to see the outcome of this report. I recall having gone through this with my community, with the entire city. There was a lot of hiccups to start, a lot of community members wanting to jump in and get involved, but not knowing how, not having any direction, even councillors not knowing exactly what to do. There was concerns, we're not talking about Hydro Ottawa, but the outage map kept getting times that were not actually coming to fruition. So people were getting hopeful, not knowing whether to leave their homes and go to a hotel because they kept thinking the lights would come back on. I say too, once again, the learning about comms and how important it is not to just rely on social media. We were without power, people were going without it. But I think maybe instead of reiterating what many of my colleagues have said, I actually just want to say thank you. I want to say thank you, not just to our first responders, the firefighters, and those were amazing, but everybody who was behind the scenes, OPH, who is coming out and doing wellness checks. Like, we were under so much extreme pressure as a city. And it was varied, right? We had communities who are completely devastated en masse. We had others who are lightly touched. I had people who were out of power for 10 days. And at the beginning of the situation, they were fine. They had food, the neighbors were all helping. They were, don't tell the fire department, they were running wires across the street for generators. Once again, I brought that to their attention, but they were making things work. But then 5 days in, they were running out of medication and no one was coming to check on them. They had to go to community centers to power up their cell phones. And we're talking about seniors. One senior had just come out of the hospital and her husband was trying to take care of her. And she couldn't get a hold of her doctor and they didn't know what to do. So, as a counselor, when I called on our city staff, the EOC, and said, listen, how can you help me help them? You mobilized OPH, you had your staff come out, we did wellness checks, you kept coming back. Nothing was perfect during this. And I don't expect that during any emergency, anything will ever be perfect. What I love about this is that we learn from it and we try to do better. I think we've taken a lot of key lessons learned from this, but I want to say thank you to the staff, many of whom were also without power. They were going out and working every day and they had the same situation we were all going through at their own personal lives. And I do want to thank all the residents who really stepped out and said, listen, we're going to help each other. We're going to get through this. And that's one of the reasons why I love our city, right? We've been through a lot over the last little while and we kind of keep rising to the occasion. So that's really what I want. I have no question for you. I think that, once again, I look forward to how we get through this. I think we can always do better. But what I wanted to say was just a profound and heartfelt thank you.
Chair, if I may, I would also like to thank counselors during this event as well. They played an extremely important part in providing us with intelligence and information from their communities. And we often don't say thank you enough to our counselors. And I think that just to reciprocate the thank you, I think it was extremely valuable to have that information. We were able to use our paramedics to go out and provide oxygen to people who didn't have oxygen. So there was a lot of work done collectively, collaboratively. And so I just thought I'd mention that while we're here.
Thank you both. Thank you, Councillor Dudas, for those kind words. And, it really is a team effort. And if people have the ability to contribute in a time of an emergency like what we've gone through, they need to step up. So thank you for those comments. Conseiller Plante?
Oui, merci beaucoup. Je pense que je vais diriger ma question vers M. Ayotte. Peut-être c'est pour vous, Madame Gooding, je ne sais pas encore, mais j'ai entendu parler qu'il va y avoir une présentation sous peu sur le 911 et les changements qui vont venir au 911. Moi, j'ai le quartier qui a le plus d'appels, 911, et je voulais juste savoir si vous pouviez inclure dans votre présentation un peu l'historique du 911, parce que je pense qu'il y a des confusions entre le 911, le 311 et tous les autres appels, et peut-être intégrer un peu les solutions à venir avec le non-emergency response, dont on parle avec la police et puis les services communautaires. Si on pourrait avoir un aperçu un peu 360 de la situation, j'apprécierais beaucoup, beaucoup. Et je vais en faire part aussi dans mes associations communautaires à Rideau-Vanier parce qu'il y a beaucoup d'enjeux où on a besoin du 911 et parfois le 311 et les gens sont un peu mêlés. Mais je voulais juste mettre ça à votre attention et j'apprécie beaucoup la présentation qu'on a aujourd'hui. Merci.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Oui, certainement, on va être capable de présenter beaucoup de ces informations au mois de mai, pendant qu'on fait notre présentation sur le 911, aussi pour voir c'est quoi qui va venir à l'avenir de 2025. C'est l'année où il faut avoir nos systèmes ajustés pour avoir la prochaine génération de 911. Certainement au mois de mai, on va être capable de vous donner cette information. Si vous avez besoin de quelque chose avant ce temps-là, vous pouvez me contacter directement. Merci.
Avez-vous des autres questions, conseiller? Non? OK, merci. OK, second rounders, Councillor Hill and then Kavanagh. Councillor Hill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to confirm with regard to the process to establish the emergency reception centers. Can you speak a little bit to how the city chooses the facilities that it'll use to host these centers?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you. It's a great question. And so we assess each situation depending on the specific context of that situation. And we determine what parts of the city may need those centers. And we work very closely with a range of partners, including recreational, cultural and facility services, to determine what city facilities may be best placed to act as emergency reception centers. For something like the derecho, we'll consider typically medium and larger size city facilities because they almost always have either a gymnasium or a pool, which means that they always have showers and change rooms, which is really important in terms of serving people over many days. But it is kind of context specific and it's a group effort to make sure that we meet the needs of the community. What I would like to just add here, though, is that this is something of a bit of a dream for us going forward and part of the reason why we're doing the community engagement is that we would love to get to a space in the future where the communities themselves are identifying, private businesses, churches, other places that could they themselves open to the public and help each other out, especially for people who may have challenges getting around. It's really important to have options within the neighborhood. So thanks.
Thank you. I think, and kind of following up on that and some questioning, I think I heard from one of my council colleagues as well in terms of that engagement with the community. And I know you spoke to the need for residents to have emergency kits and other personal support. What resources are available by the city to support our residents in building out those personal emergency kits?
Thanks again, Mr. Chair. So we do have a lot of resources available on the web. So for example, we have personal guidelines in terms of checklists and so forth and how to prepare yourself at the family and individual level for the first 72 hours of an emergency. I had mentioned earlier that we have that new community emergency management toolkit that's aimed at organized groups and helping them to develop emergency plans. And we also have the counselor handbook because you're definitely part of Team Ottawa, and we rely on the unique roles that you play during an emergency. And I can also market our services a bit too. We're very happy to meet with community groups and discuss with them and present on this material.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Councillor Kavanaugh and then Johnson.
Thank you. I apologize for prolonging. I know this has been a long meeting. I was just talking to our fire chief, and I wanted to know if it's possible for the city to do an inventory of buildings that do not have generators. Do we have that capacity somehow? Because it's kind of like identifying vulnerable communities. We need to know which ones they are. And they are basically vertical vulnerable communities during a power outage. Do we have that capacity, and how would we go about it?
I can't speak to planning, but I can speak to the fact that if we wanted to create that capacity, we could. We have tools available to us. The fire chief can speak to pre-plans that we do of every building, and they would identify in our CAD system whether or not they have a generator or not. So it's just a matter of picking that as an item that we would select out and then create a list. So I think that there'd be some work to do to create that, but we could certainly look at that. And then we'd have to look at building services, et cetera, and what they might have on file with regards to some of these systems and whether or not they're electronic files or not. And but we can certainly follow up on that.
I'd appreciate it. We'll keep in touch. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson, and then Devine. Councillor Johnson.
I don't know if this is preemptive, but I know that the province just released, announced a great deal of funding coming for emergency preparedness. And I just wonder if you guys can comment on how that funding might be useful to us and what we're doing to get ready to apply.
Thank you, through you, Chair. Some of that funding is for smaller municipalities and how to help them prepare for these types of events. And they offer funding for emergency exercises, et cetera, but we already have a program in place. So certainly I can ask Beth to speak to maybe some of the specifics of what she sees in it. But at this point in time, we're always seeking partnerships with the province to help fund some of the programs we need to move forward on. So we'll certainly have a look at a deep dive into the line by line with regards to those that funding opportunity and seek it out if it's applicable to us.
Just on that note, the recent budget announcement, my East End colleagues, Councillor Kitts in particular, have raised concerns about cost incurred and not the follow-through resources from the province. Has this recent budget provided funding to recoup costs that we've incurred?
Chair, not that I'm aware of, but again, once we do our deeper dive into what the budget actually says and what is available to us, we'll certainly look at that.
Fair enough. Okay, thank you. Councillor Devine.
Thank you, Chair. I kind of just want to follow up on the angle that Councillor Johnson was taking earlier about the mixed messages that we might be sending to communities and residents. And this is in reference, Beth, to what you were saying earlier, that one of our tactics, and it's a very wise, practical tactic, is to try to do an audit of the resources that we have available, including engaging community associations and other groups to help identify what might be areas in their ward for, like an operations center, or where's a facility, or what resources might you have. And I fully applaud that kind of work. I think that kind of identifying our resources is integral. I've already said that I think that the role that community members and community groups can play is essential. But I do think that in a way, we are sending a mixed message, whereas in one breath, we're saying, you are our best asset. We need you to help us. And on the other breath, we're saying, you need to pay $5,000 of director and officer liability insurance in order to have a garden. And whether it's communities who are organizing chainsaw crews, or communities who are running rinks, or communities who are putting gardens in place so that our community can address our climate needs, they are all providing a volunteer service to the benefit of our community. They're not recouping profits off this. And so I think that we as a city need to put measures in place, whereas we are encouraging and motivating their participation, not putting up hurdles and challenges. So I'm not speaking at all of any kind of way that is critical to what you're doing, because you are not in any way putting up barriers to this kind of engagement, but in a sense, the city does. I was at 2 community meetings this past week where they're considering 2 community association meetings where they're considering disbanding because they can't afford the insurance to run the rink or to do the garden. And so they're saying, we're just going to disband. And so we are losing a massive resource because I know that the cost of insurance is escalating, but that's not their fault. And we're going to lose that resource. So at some point, I'm not sure who to talk to, but we've got to talk to somebody. Thank you.
We'll take that as a comment and not a question at this time, Councillor. Any further questions before I provide comments? No, I want to thank staff for the report. I think it's very important to do this after event review that you've conducted to focus on the city's response in particular. And if you look at last term in particular, where we had floods and a tornado and the LRT launch and the occupation and then a derecho, our staff went through a lot. Our residents went through a lot. And I think in my first 6 years as a councillor, we had declarations of emergencies 4 of the 6 years, which our staff were engaged in and trying to address throughout the city. So our staff and residents have been put through a lot over the last few years. As part of the boot camp training that I attended with some of my new colleagues this term, there was a slide that talked about 30 types of disasters our staff plan for. First it was 10, now it's 30, things that keep me up at night. And the one that I'm really concerned about that we know is going to happen more and more are freezing rainstorms. That as the climate change and this particular area of Eastern Ontario gets warmer, we're going to have more freezing rain. And I lived through the ice storm of the late 90s. And I'm concerned about a period of heavy freezing rain and then a deep freeze and how we're going to get through that, which could be weeks, and the ability for hydro crews to get in those very challenging parts of the area to restore power. So we do have to plan accordingly for different events. I was without power. I have lost track 9 or 10 days for the derecho, and basically lived at the Hunt Club Riverside Park Community Center for that period, which became a hub. Staff were excellent in responding to the needs of the community, set up a command center, and people came in, shower and got food. And I just think I was so impressed by the city in that response, having lived through that and the services that were provided. Councillor Dulas is right, it wasn't perfect, but it was well done, and we were supposed to learn from this and refine it. So a few things. One, down power lines. In normal times, we say call 911. The police were actually saying, putting communications out there, don't call 911. And I think at that time is because the system was overwhelmed, the volume of calls they were getting. But we have to have a better system in place, what residents do when they're alive down power lines. I recently issued a public inquiry about the city's response this year, the continued work about down trees. My understanding is there's still hundreds of stumps, exposed roots that have to be taken away in trees that still need to be addressed. The sidewalk closest to my house is like this right now because a tree came down, but we really haven't addressed that. So there's some post-storm work this year. Councillor Hubley's point and others about that not everyone has the ability to receive communications because they don't have either a particular mode to get that information. But if we have community hubs that had bulletin boards when you walked in, or maybe on the glass outside, so there's 24-hour ability to read it. But today's announcements, today's information from the city, today's focus in the community are as follows. So we could standardize that information. At least people can be made aware of where the hubs are and have information posted. And if the Citizen and Sun and the Dwa could take space and say, here are your community hubs today, here are the services that are being offered, go there if you need assistance. The motion that MPP Pasma had that Councillor Devine moved locally, I think, and Councillor Kavanagh raised today, we do need a plan to serve people who are stuck, who are in high rises, who are in multi-unit dwellings, who do not have the means to get out. And to credit to the fire service and others who were able to reach many of these residents. But again, this will be an ongoing concern, particularly in units that don't have generators. Councillor King and I had a motion in June where there were a number of issues that were raised from our residents in multiple wards with Hydro Ottawa's response. Yes, we had to get people in the field and get power restored. That was the main focus, but communication, lack of information was a major concern as well. And I'm not going to rehash that this morning. We had a good airing this out. We had a motion passed that the Mayor Watson was to write to the CEO, and we listed 5 main concerns that needed to be addressed. And to date, that letter has not been responded to or replied to. So the direction today is basically to ask city staff to approach Hydro Ottawa and remind them that we're looking for a response. So I have a simple direction, and it says on June 22nd, 2022, City Council passed a motion, King Brockington motion 7911, directing the mayor to write to the CEO of Hydro Ottawa outlining 5 major concerns council had with the response to the derecho, focused on communications, modernization of the grid, understanding the vulnerabilities of the existing infrastructure, and planning for contingencies. To date, the letter from Mayor Watson has not been formally replied to. Would staff undertake the step of contacting Hydro Ottawa, reminding them of this important communication? And Caitlin's just stepped out, but she did confirm that the clerk's office is supportive of this direction. So I just wanted to table that. Thank you. The last piece, to echo colleagues' concerns, that is how we can better educate, inform grassroots response to emergencies. The Boy Scout motto has always been be prepared. We, as part of our communications, talk about people needing to be sort of self-supportive for the first 72 hours. And there's a lot of good will and good people out there that have resources that can really help in an emergency. And what we're trying to do in River Ward is identify, well, what inventory exists? Who has barbecues? Which churches have barbecues? Which churches have inventories of baby food and formally, if they run a food bank or if they run a clothing depot? And who has the ability to remain open with kitchen facilities that can do maybe a meal a day? We need to take stock of that. And we need to have people on the ready that should an emergency hit, we can have that, because the city might be overwhelmed, because Salvation Army and Red Cross might be serving other harder hit areas. When the tornado hit in 2018, couldn't get them to come to River Ward. They were all in West Carleton and then in Trent Arlington. And that's okay, because they were the communities that needed the help the most. But still, the pockets in my area, we had to make do on our own, and that's okay. But I think one of the takeaways is how can we better educate, inform, even train local communities to contribute appropriately when emergencies hit in the future. So thank you, Johnson, for asking for the more detailed report. I think that's very important, and for the questions that have been asked here this morning. So thank you to staff. Okay. Yes, do we receive the report we've had this morning?
Received.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you again to staff. All right, I'm just looking for my agenda. No in-camera items. Item 7, the IPD report on the use of delegated authority during the 2022 by the Emergency and Protective Services Department. That's just noted for the agenda. Any notices of motion? Seeing none. Any inquiries? Seeing none. Any other business? Seeing none. Before we adjourn, I'll just note that at our next meeting in April 20th, we will receive bylaws 2021 and 2022 annual report. So looking forward to that. And at our May meeting, as we heard today, Public Safety Service 2021, 2022 annual reports, and the 911 2021 and 2022 annual reports. That's at our May agenda. So just to look ahead for the next 2 meetings. Okay, we are adjourned. Our business is concluded. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.